This lecture will deal with ancient Egypt. I'm going to provide a basic overview and talk a little bit about the formation of a unified dynasty that will define Egypt. And there will be some focus on the Palette of Narmer and Egyptian conventions. The Palette of Narmer is the monument that you'll be comparing to the Standard of Ur from the Sumerian culture. So I want to give you a little bit of information. I'll talk about both of those monuments in the context of that assignment and just give you a few tips moving forward. I want to begin with a map of Egypt, and this is a focused map. If you want to see Mesopotamia, you're going to have to go further to the east. And if you want to get to places like Greece or Italy, you're going to go north and further west. You can see the Mediterranean here. Egyptian civilization would establish itself along the banks of the Nile River. It's a little different from what we see in the ancient Near East, where we had two rivers. Here we have one river. So instead of the Tigris and the Euphrates, here we have the Nile. But it shouldn't be lost on you that we see settlement from a very early date in both areas in association with rivers where there is water, which can be used for cultivation of crops. And we see as people settle and eventually adopt an agricultural lifestyle in these areas, they're able to learn irrigation techniques to be able to be particularly productive and prolific in terms of agriculture, which is going to be important to support life. In Egypt, we talk about Lower Egypt, which is closer to the Mediterranean, and we talk about Upper Egypt, which is further to the south. It seems a little counterintuitive, but the Nile runs from south to north, and it spills into the Mediterranean. You can see the delta. You see that it kind of spreads out, and there's a few more of these sort of tributaries and rivers that spread into the Mediterranean. So again, kind of counterintuitive, the way in which the Nile runs. We talk about Upper Egypt to the south and Lower Egypt to the north. Now, Upper Egypt is a little bit drier, rockier, a little bit more rustic. Lower Egypt is more opulent, urban, populated. This is where we're going to see throughout ancient history, there's a lot of trade that is going to happen here. Different cultures will set up trading colonies. The Greeks, for instance, will set up a trading colony now Creta's, which will be really instrumental and important for the development of building techniques and quarrying techniques for the Greeks further along. We're not quite there yet, and we'll talk about that again when we get there. But this is essentially a fertile valley. It's rich in game and wildlife, and much of what today is desert was once filled with grasses that supported game and agriculture as well. A point that I think is kind of interesting relative to this is that after Roman conquest of this area, because Egypt will become part of the Roman Empire in 30 BCE or BC, and Egypt was something that the Romans really wanted and needed because of the grain production that occurred here. It was a huge grain producer. It was considered the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. And so having Egypt as part of the Roman world, as the Roman world grew through conquest, this is going to provide grain to feed the empire, which is extremely important. Today we don't think of it that way, but it was extremely important at that time. Now, settlement is going to focus here around the cycles of the Nile's annual flood. So the Nile does flood, or did flood, annually. Today it doesn't through the building of dams, notably the Aswan Dam. But due to the construction of dams today, they're able to keep things, keep the water level at their desired level. But in the Egyptian period, in the ancient period, there was an annual flood. We call it the inundation, and it is part of what the Egyptians were able to harness in order to create really fertile fields, because the banks of the Nile would have deposits, very like diatomaceous soil and very rich soils from the river that would be deposited onto the banks through this flood. And when the waters would recede, all of this great sort of fertilizer would be left behind. And so they were able to also, in terms of the water, to build dams for agriculture. So they could come up with irrigation techniques, which they were able to take the water from the Nile. They could benefit from the annual inundation, but then also control the water from the Nile to create irrigation so that that would also support the agricultural efforts that were so important to both Egypt, but also further afield later on in Egypt's history. This agricultural society centered around the cycles of nature. So it's really understandable that the culture's development would be defined by the Nile. And we'll talk a little bit about the inundation now. The inundation happens annually. It did, at least. I mean, it still happens, but today it's not going to cause the kind of flooding that it once did. And we refer to this as the inundation. It's essentially the flooding of the Nile. And a source of the Nile is here in modern-day Ethiopia. I've got this modern overlay map. In modern Ethiopia, we have Lake Tana. And Lake Tana is a source for the Nile. And June through September is the rainy season around Lake Tana in Ethiopia. And the water levels start to rise in July. And then you're going to see flooding in the Nile as the water moves towards the Mediterranean, right? Because it moves south to north. You're going to see flooding July through October. And that's a very important period in terms of creating the environment in which agriculture would be sustained along the Nile. And it would happen annually, and this is how they were able to continue to have powerful crops without depleting their soil. It was largely because of the inundation. That was so important to their culture, the development of civilization. Inhabitants of the Nile Valley became sedentary around 8000 BCE. Agriculture was adopted around 5500 BCE, and around 3150 BCE, Upper and Lower Egypt would consolidate into one state. This is around the same time that we see the development of the city-states in Sumeria and the ancient Near East. And so keep that in mind, that we have these two groups, or two areas where we have groups that are settling and have settled and are creating really sophisticated civilizations. And for this reason is why this the assignment for this week is going to be to compare a monument from ancient Egypt to a monument from the ancient Near East, a Sumerian monument. The last Egyptian ruler, Cleopatra, would be deposed by the Romans under Augustus in 31 BCE, and Egypt would come under Roman control at that point. And I'll talk a little bit more about the rulers of Egypt as we move forward. But much of what we know about Egypt is based on the obsession with death that the Egyptians had. So they had a lot of monuments associated with death that are preserved because it was so important. They built monuments, funerary monuments, for instance, that were very permanent, very long-lasting because of the materials that they chose and the techniques that they chose. Now, written records number very few, especially because there was the loss of over 700,000 documents in a fire that occurred during the Roman period, a fire in the library in Alexandria, which is right here, where a lot of these documents were housed. So again, the obsession with death is going to be really important because we don't have as many documents preserved. And we talked about cuneiform tablets, those clay tablets that preserved writing and documents for the ancient Near Eastern cultures. And we looked at a Sumerian cuneiform tablet, I think last lecture that I gave. The Egyptians used they used more of a paper-like product. It was made out of plants. It was made out of papyrus, and we call it papyrus. And it was a much more fragile material. And therefore, had they been using clay tablets, a fire, you still would have some of them preserved. But papyrus was extremely fragile and delicate, and so great loss when there was the fire in Alexandria in the library. Now, around the same time, again, as the city-states are developing in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt is unifying under what would be dynastic rule. And dynastic rule is essentially rule by individuals that pass that rule down to their family. We see a series of dynastic families. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So in the 3rd century BCE, a guy by the name of Manetho, so the 3rd century BCE is the 200s BCE, right? A guy named Manetho lived at that time in Egypt, and he prepared a chronological listing of Egyptian rulers. He went from about 3150 to 332, so he stopped in the 4th century BCE, but he grouped all of these rulers into 30 families or dynasties. This is a great service that he did for modern scholars, and the work of Manetho was preserved, and later scholars were able to further categorize these dynasties into broad historical groups. So there was broad historical groups that we talk about, and this is an artificial construct that modern scholars have applied to the span of history in ancient Egypt. We talk about the early dynastic period, about 3000 to 2575 BCE, the Old Kingdom, about 2575 to 2041 BCE, the Middle Kingdom, about 2040 to 1550 BCE, and the New Kingdom, about 1550 to 1070 BCE. One of the things that I can say is that in the Old Kingdom, that's when pyramids were built, if this helps you to create some benchmarks for yourself. Pyramids would not be built in the Middle Kingdom, nor would they be built in the New Kingdom. At that point, they would move toward rock-hewn, rock-cut tombs. King Tut, or Tutankhamun, that you may have heard of, he's one of the more popular kings of ancient Egypt. He lived during the New Kingdom, and his tomb, where all of the great grave goods were found, was one of these rock-hewn, multi-chambered, but cut into the natural rock, one of these rock tombs. That was what we would find in the New Kingdom. So it gives you a couple of things that you can things you probably know already that you can kind of slot in, and maybe that gives a little bit of help kind of clarifying some of this progression. Now, the changes, right, say 241 to 240, Old Kingdom to Middle Kingdom, these are, again, artificial constructs that were created. This progression is an artificial construct that was created by scholars. And that demarcation, it isn't like all of a sudden everybody said, okay, Old Kingdom's over, we're into Middle Kingdom. These are broad bracket dates, and they give us a sense of change. And there are some historical events that took place that led to the change, but we begin to see changes in the culture and civilization. And that's where these periods, or this periodization, comes from. So the religion of ancient Egypt is polytheistic. They worshipped many gods. If you are Christian, if you are Jewish, if you are Muslim, you are practicing a monotheistic religion with one god. But the ancient Egyptians, like the cultures that we looked at in the ancient Near East, they're polytheistic. They believe in many gods. The Egyptians had a creation myth that tells of a supreme god that rose up from the primeval waters on a mound and was responsible for the creation of the world and all of its creatures. This is a creation myth. Many ancient cultures have creation myths. The supreme god in this creation myth and in this pantheon, or this complex genealogy that exists in ancient Egyptian belief, that supreme god is known as Ra. And over time, Ra, who's associated with the sun, considered sun god, Ra over Egyptian history is sometimes referred to as Re, Ra, Amen, or Aton. There are different names that are applied to this specific sun god, but this is the chief deity in this pantheon. And when I say pantheon, again, it comes from the Greek pan, which means all, and theos, which means God. When I say pantheon, I'm talking about all the gods taken together as part of this genealogy. Later generations are going to formalize that mound, that legendary mound from this creation myth. They're going to formalize it as a pyramidal shape known as the Ben-Ben. And I bring this up because pyramids will figure large in the Old Kingdom, and I want you to understand that architectural shapes can have, or architecture itself can have, an iconography or a symbolism. It can have meaning. Buildings can be bearers of meaning. And this is a great culture to introduce that and talk about that, because the pyramidal funerary structures that are, I would assume, generally known to all of you. If you don't know a lot about them, but you know that the pyramids existed, and it's where the ancient Egyptians placed some of their most royal and significant dead. They have meaning that ties back to this creation myth that's part of their mythology, that's critical towards their religious beliefs. Hieroglyphics, this is the writing that develops around the turn of the millennium, and we talked about the development of cuneiform for the ancient Near Eastern Sumerians, again, also the turn of the millennium around 3000. We're going to find similarly that hieroglyphics are developing around the same time. So there's some interesting things going on in Mesopotamia and also going on in the Nile Valley at around the same time. We see these civilizations developing. Like cuneiform, hieroglyphics is a development from pictures that take on sounds and become a written language. So pictures that will be distilled down like with cuneiform. The Rosetta Stone is how this was all discovered, or how hieroglyphics were deciphered, I guess I should say. The Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799, and it includes a text that is a decree honoring Ptolemy V, was one of the Egyptian rulers. The text on this stone, that's carved into this stone, it dates to about 196 BCE. Now, there's 3 different languages, or 3 different texts on the surface of the stone, and I'll show you this quickly, and I'm going to go back because I want you to be able to see the text. Okay, you have hieroglyphics here. You have something called Demotic, which is a language spoken by the people, a sort of colloquial, and then you have Greek down at the bottom, a more formal Greek. So they figured out pretty early on that probably the 3 languages, or the 3 sections, probably said the same thing, but just in 3 different languages. They could read Greek, they could read the Demotic, they couldn't read the hieroglyphics. And it wasn't for 20-some years until the key to deciphering hieroglyphics was configured by a Frenchman by the name of Jean-François Champollion. And he essentially was able to decipher hieroglyphics because, and here again the Rosetta Stone, everywhere that you see this sort of oval-shaped framing device, you see a few of them, he was able to configure, that's the name of Ptolemy V. That's Ptolemy V. That's Ptolemy V. And he could break down Ptolemy V every time he saw this oval shape, and he was able to then extrapolate and decipher. So, and in fact, these are called cartouches, and the cartouche is a sort of framing device, and it goes around names. And so this was a really important development. And now, from that time, we can read hieroglyphics, and we know what it says. But from those pictures, just like the development of cuneiform, from those pictures, it's a distillation down much further. So I could talk a little bit more about the development of hieroglyphics, and also about the unification of Egypt and the beginning of unified dynastic Egypt, by looking at this monument called the Palette of King Narmer. This is one monument. You are looking at it from its backside, and if you flip this over, you're going to see the front side. This is found in the more southern part of Egypt, in a place called Hierakonpolis. And this is an important object because we believe that we're essentially seeing history of Egypt expressed through conflict between 2 regions that ended up in their unification under a god king who is identified on this monument as Narmer. So thus the Palette of Narmer. Now, what is a palette? A palette is, in ancient Egypt, a palette is an object on which makeup would be mixed. So the front side here, you can see there's a depression here. This is where makeup, we call it kohl, K-O-H-L. It is a black tar-like substance that would be mixed with water, and then will be applied to the face underneath the eyes. And it's this sort of heavy eyeliner, but it had a function. It wasn't just aesthetic. It functioned to deflect the sun's rays. So kind of like a football player maybe wearing the face black to help with the sun if it's a particularly sunny day. People in field sports might wear something like that as well. It's the same idea. And in ancient Egypt, they wore this heavier black eyeliner. Now, there are lots of palettes that have been found in ancient Egypt in archaeological excavations. They're much smaller than this very large palette. This is 2 feet 1 inch high. So that means it's 25 inches in height. That's quite large. And if you think about applying makeup as a utilitarian, kind of function, right? This is to deflect the sun's rays. It's something that in a sunny part of the world you might, want to have something to help you with sun's rays. And yet you don't need something this large. So when we see something that is decorated in this way, it's very ornate in terms of the relief decoration, that's relief carving on both surfaces, we tend to think that this is maybe a more significant object, probably a ceremonial object, commemorative object, maybe not even an object that was used to mix kohl, or maybe only used on special occasions because it is so special. And it has a utilitarian function, but probably its function was something maybe more symbolic and more commemorative. So this object, we believe that it tells us of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, and it's also an important object in terms of the development of hieroglyphics. So I'm going to start on the back side, and some of the comments I'll make apply to both sides, but I'll start with the story that is being told, or what we know from the figures that we see. I'm going to start on the back. So the first thing you want to notice is that you have a separation of the imagery into registers. And it's the same thing on the front side. You have ground lines that delineate 3 sections, and then there's a little hovering ground line here with a figure. And you see the same on the reverse as well. So at the very top, we have the heads of these 2 bulls. This is Hathor. Hathor is a deity that, and in Egypt, their gods were represented as animals oftentimes, or half animal, half human. Some cultures, their gods take human form, other cultures, their gods take animal form, and some, like the Egyptians, they do a little bit of both. But Hathor is a deity that is sacred to Narmer. Narmer is identified here. It's a hieroglyphic. I'm going to go over here for a second. I think this one's a little bit more legible. It's a fish. You can see the tail of the fish, the head of the fish, and a chisel. That's Nar and Mer. That's how you would pronounce that, the hieroglyphic. And Hathor's head, and it's on both sides, you have Hathor's head flanking Narmer. And then you see down here this large figure that we believe is Narmer. Narmer would be that ruler that is represented. That is the individual who is credited on this document with unifying Upper and Lower Egypt and the beginning of dynastic rule in this unified culture civilization. So let's talk about the image here. We have the largest figure standing. He is showing us his torso frontal, his legs are in profile, his eye, I guess that would be his right eye, is frontal, right? If you see somebody from profile, you don't see their eye fully frontal on the side of their head. So there's a combination of perspectives going on here. Twisted perspective. We talked about that when we looked at the offering to Inanna votive vessel in the lecture on the ancient Near Eastern, the last lecture that I gave. So this idea of twisting the body to show different parts of the body to better effect. You show the torso frontal, you're showing a kind of power center. You show the legs in profile, you're showing ability to move. Combining these together is something that can create a bit of a tension and creates a kind of a power kind of an image. And then you see here the smaller guy behind, he's carrying sandals and he has a little vessel. Now our ruler here, he is barefoot. This is his servant who stands behind him carrying his sandals, suggesting perhaps that he is on some kind of sacred ground. Now the figure is wearing a kilt, our standing figure, our Narmer figure, he wears a kilt, he wears the bull's tail, and he has on this interesting headdress or crown, looks like a bowling pin, and this is a crown that is associated with Upper Egypt, the Upper Egyptian crown, and his arm is extended outward, he holds a scepter, and then he is pushing down another figure with his other hand, and it looks as if he is going to swing this hand and hit this figure. Now, up above, we have a hawk, and we have a head that looks quite similar to the head below here, the head that's being held down by Narmer, and then these interesting plant-like forms. These are papyrus blossoms, papyrus flowers, and it's a man-headed papyrus plant being attacked or landed on with the talons of this hawk. This is a kind of early hieroglyph telling us something very similar to what's going on in this image. The hawk is Horus, Horus. Horus is also sacred to the kings of Egypt who rule in Horus's guise during their lifetime. Horus is very sacred. So here we have a symbol for the king, and then the papyrus, right? This guy, our king, Narmer, is wearing the crown of Upper Egypt. And then we have the papyrus that is being attacked by the hawk. And that papyrus is a plant that grows in Egypt, and it grows notably in Lower Egypt, that more opulent and there's greater growth, and it's less rustic, less dry, this more opulent region of Egypt. So what we have is a image that in symbolic form is probably aligned with or parallel to the more literal image of the man about to hit this other male figure with a scepter. And then there are a few other hieroglyphics around. Then down below we have figures that look just like this guy that's being pushed down, and they appear to be floating through space or running through space, possibly trying to escape, possibly they have already been hit. It's hard to say. And it's also, we talk about this image showing us this unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, but certainly unification of Upper and Lower Egypt wasn't one man getting hit with a stick. So we have to extrapolate and think about this image as standing in for a much larger military action that would have brought these two places together. Now, I want to flip over to the front side. We've got other interesting images and maybe a little bit more complex images taking place here. The top register is the same with Hathor and Narmer. And then we have that same figure, right? He's got the kilt, he's got the tail, he's showing us his frontal torso, his legs are in profile, but he's wearing a different crown. This is a kind of chair-like crown. That chair-like crown is the crown associated with Lower Egypt. And we see here the hieroglyphic telling us, yep, this is Narmer. And you see his servant, same guy, standing behind, much smaller. And then you see some other figures that are also much smaller than Narmer that are walking, and it begins to look like, wait, we have maybe a military parade. We have figures holding standards. These would be almost like flagpoles with different emblems on them. They're carrying them in procession towards these figures here. And the figures that you see here are laying on their backs. They're decapitated, and their heads are between their legs. We see them from an aerial view, so we're above them looking down, but we see the military parade from an elevation view or from the side, from a kind of profile view. Not only do we see the combination of perspectives in the representation of a singular figure, right, the frontal torso, the profile legs, the frontal eye. Here we're seeing a scene that's playing out with different perspectives or a combination of perspectives. The military parade shows best from a kind of elevation, right? The ground up. We see these figures walking in profile. But if you maintained that same perspective for these decapitated figures, presumably these figures that Narmer is going to review, going to look over, right, to see what, some battle has taken place. These people are defeated, and now he's going to go review what we see. These figures wouldn't look like much if they were not from an aerial view. We can see more of them. So they've combined different perspectives. The Egyptians aren't going to be the only culture to do this. We've already talked about how the ancient Near Eastern culture, the Sumerian culture at least, that is roughly contemporary with what we're looking at here, they did that. Think of the offerings to Inanna votive vessel that we looked at, and the figures bringing the goods to the deity, and they too were in a similar twisted perspective pose. Down below, we have a kind of enigmatic scene where we have these mythological animals that are twisting their heads. Their heads are being held, controlled by these two figures, and it creates the depression in the center here. This could be, one is Lower Egypt, one is Upper Egypt, in a sort of symbolic way of showing the control of them together, a kind of emblem that may be distinguishing the event that we believe the palette is associated with, this unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Now down below, in the lowermost register, we have a bull. We have a figure that looks kind of similar to these guys over here on the backside. And then we have something here. Again, combination of perspectives. You're seeing a city. You're seeing a city wall. You're seeing a building in elevation. Combining perspectives in one scene to give all of the information from its best effect. And I might also go back to cave painting, where we saw at Lascaux in the Hall of the Bulls, where you saw bulls that were in profile, but the horns were twisted so that you could see both of the horns. So this idea of taking liberties and showing scenes or individual figures or animals from multiple perspectives is something that is very indicative of, or let's see, maybe that's not the right word. It's something that helps us to read the image. And reading the image and conveying content or conveying meaning is so important. So these are liberties that are taken. And you could refer to these as conventions. The convention of twisting perspective. There are other conventions that are here as well. One that I think is notable is the convention that you see here or here. And it's a hierarchy of scale. The most important figure is largest. The lesser important figure is smaller. These conventions are ways that the Egyptians are showing, giving the viewer more information about who's important and what role they play in the image. They can twist the perspective. They can make one figure larger, one figure smaller, and it's ways of conveying aspects of the narrative to the viewer. So here, a detailed slide, we have those symbols, Hathor and Horus. We have hieroglyphics. We have Narmer. We have the man-headed papyrus. And then we have these conventions, the arranging of scenes or arranging of content in registers. The hierarchic, or some people refer, or sometimes we refer to this as hieratic. The larger the figure, it's a scale that's associated with its hierarchy of scale. The largest figures are most important. And then, of course, the twisted perspective or fractional representation or composite view if we see it in a scene. We talked about arrangement in registers from the Sumerian period. We talked about twisted perspective from the Sumerian period. So this isn't something that is happening only in Egypt. It is something that is also happening in Mesopotamia. And this is a nice comparison for that reason. This is not the monument from the Sumerian culture that you're going to be comparing for the writing assignment. You're going to be comparing this to the standard of Ur, which I will show you, but I want you to go through and prepare that comparison and following the prompt that's in the assignment. So I'm not going to give you everything, but I want to give you a good start. And then here's the front side again in just a different slide. And the view of the town and the volcano, this is from Çatalhöyük. And again, I can talk about twisted perspective or composite perspective in cave painting from the prehistoric Paleolithic period. I can talk about the Neolithic period and the combining of perspectives, and I can talk about a historic period. I can talk about the Sumerians, or I can talk about the Egyptians. This is something that we see throughout. So far, we've seen this throughout, so something to keep in mind. Now, the monument that you're going to be focusing on, that you're going to be comparing to the Palette of Narmer, is this monument, the Standard of Ur. I'm going to talk a little bit about what this is, what we believe it is. In truth, we don't really know what it is. It's in the British Museum, so when you go to the British Museum to see the Rosetta Stone, you can also go and see this object. It's pretty cool. It's not that large. It's 8 inches by, 12 by 19 inches. So it's not that large. When it was excavated at Ur by Leonard Woolley, they didn't know what it was. And people make assumptions, and then it just sort of goes into the record, essentially. So they didn't know what it was, and he suggested, Woolley did, who was the archaeologist on site, that perhaps this object was carried on a pole and that it was a standard, right? So perhaps this was something that was carried. We don't know. it's impossible to know, but essentially it is a wooden frame, and then onto which you have shell, lapis lazuli, I think there's some red limestone here, and it's all set onto its frame through the use of bitumen, bitumen. Bitumen is a tar-like substance that can be used as an adhesive, and we see this in ancient Mesopotamia. So remember, this is a Sumerian object, and this is the object that you will be comparing according to the prompt for this week, that you'll be comparing to the palette of Narmer. And I'm just going to read something from the assignment. Let's see, the Sumerian standard of Ur and the Egyptian palette of Narmer both employ visual content that expresses power. For this assignment, you will write a summary description of each work of art and address how these two works of art created by two different cultures are similar in their visual expression of power and how they are different in their visual expression of power. So you're going to think about those conventions, you're going to think about what's similar, what's different. Remember, these are two different cultures, but they both talk about power. So I wanted to show you, visually talk about power. So I wanted to show you this object. It has two sides, and I'm showing you one side here. This is oftentimes referred to as the peace side. And here, we'll go here, the peace side of the standard of Ur. And again, this was found in a funerary. It's found in a tomb, essentially found in the royal cemetery. And here you can see what we believe is maybe getting prepared for a banquet, starting at the bottom, moving up to the top, and then you see figures seated, you see music, there's a harp, people are drinking, they have cups in their hands. I leave it to you to think about the conventions and how those conventions perhaps convey aspects of power. And then on the reverse side, right, so opposite the side you see here, on the reverse side, we have scenes that often it is referred to as battle or war side of the standard of Ur. We have chariots, horse-drawn chariots, and you see people being defeated, being trampled, and then some prisoners that are being taken up here. You can see soldiers, and then the prisoners that aren't outfitted, but rather nude, and they're being brought up here before an individual, and we see another chariot, probably the chariot associated with the figure right here, who might be the most important figure. But again, I want you to talk about what these two monuments have in common. I want you to talk about the expression of power, how it's similar and how it's different. And I'm purposefully stopping short from giving you too much information because I want you to look at these two monuments. And again, the monuments that you're going to be looking at, it's going to be comparing the palette of King Narmer that we've just talked about to the standard of Ur. And they're both in your textbook, and there's information also from Smart History, so you should go through all of the required content and go through the assignment instructions very carefully. Go through slowly, read, make sure that you understand that you cannot use quotation from your text. Make sure that you understand the style issues that I bring up. I don't want direct quotation, but I also do not want you to narrate your process. I want you to make the monuments the subject and the focus at all times. And it's really important how you craft your essay. So I would suggest that you outline first, at least even a cursory outline where you give yourself some indication of how you might approach this, what order you might take to make sure that what you've prepared for me is tight, concise, succinct, to the point, and addresses the issues very clearly. But I want you to think about power. I want you to think about how these monuments from two different cultures, how they address power. You know, where is power? How is power expressed? And again, follow the instructions very carefully toward that end. All right. Thanks a lot.